Okay, well, I'm going to get things kicked off here. Good evening and welcome to the second of three keynote lectures of the 2021 Southern Studies Conference virtual program organized by Auburn University of Montgomery. My name is David Hughes. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at AUM. First, I want to start by thanking the members of the Southern Studies Conference and its planning committee for pivoting to the virtual format this year. I want to thank Andrew McMichael, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, Kim Brackett, the Associate Dean, for supporting the conference, and Catherine Ashmore for managing the logistics of all of our operations here. The conference events span from tonight through Thursday evening. So here you can see the remaining panels that we have. They include one more public lecture and a student research panel. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for those events. One note about format, along with my colleagues, I will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat areas during tonight's lecture. So please use these spaces to raise any questions you have. We'll moderate the discussion at the end of the talk. And if you want to be named, please just provide your name with your question. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Charles S. Bullock III. Dr. Bullock is a distinguished university professor of public and international affairs, the Richard B. Russell Professor of Political Science, and the Josiah Meigs Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Georgia, where he has been teaching Georgians since he joined the university faculty in 1968. He's a prolific writer and researcher. He's published over 30 books and 150 articles. This year alone, he has 3 new books coming out. The second edition of his text, Redistricting, the Most Political Activity in America. He also has Special Elections, the Backdoor Entrance to Congress, which he's co-authored with Karen Owen. And this fall, his co-edited book with Mark Rozell will come out, the 7th edition of New Politics of the Old South. He's a recipient of research grants from the National Science Foundation, the National Institute of Education, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the American Enterprise Institute. He's won just countless awards for his work, and he's twice been named a senior fellow at Oxford's Rothermere American Institute. Most importantly, though, I think Dr. Bullock is a beloved teacher and mentor to his University of Georgia students. He regularly teaches courses on legislative and Southern politics. And let me just tell you that as one of his one-time teaching assistants, he remains the only lecturer I have ever seen to receive a standing ovation from his students at the conclusion of each term. In 2015, he was named a university professor, an honor bestowed on faculty annually who make a significant impact on the University of Georgia. And since 1977, he's been a director of the Georgia Legislative Internship Program, placing generations of future leaders into Georgia politics. We're very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Bullock and to learn more about his work this evening in a talk entitled The South, Growth versus Stagnation and Partisan Change. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Charles Bullock.
Thank you, David. Let me see here. We can get this set up so I can find my slides here somewhere. Let's see. Yeah, there we are, I believe. Yeah. There we are. All right. We're ready to go now. Okay. You know, for non-Southerners, they see the South pretty much as just one undifferentiated Mississippi. Now, if I were talking about Southern culture, I would challenge that and say, no, there's very different types of barbecue across the South, and we could have a very interesting discussion on that. But I don't have that much culture in me, although I do like a lot of barbecue. But as a political scientist, you know, what really interests political scientists is how people vote. And the main thing that determines how you might vote is probably your partisanship. And so as a political scientist, I feel like I'm very fortunate that I'm getting to live to see a second realignment. I think that's what's going to happen here in the South. I know one realignment's already taken place. And the South went from being the solid Democratic South, where Republicans were never seen for decades, to a pretty solid Republican South. And now what we're beginning to see is some movement back in the opposite direction, with some Democrats beginning to win some contests. So I'm going to talk some about that. Traditionally, the South, at least politically, has been divided between the Deep South and the Rim South. The Deep South was South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then the Rim South kind of circled around that, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, Texas, and then even picked up Florida. And Bill Key didn't talk about Rim and Deep South in his classic study of Southern politics, but it kind of grows out of Key. And Key makes the statement that the hard core of the political South and the backbone of Southern political unity is made up of those counties and sections of the Southern states in which Blacks constitute a substantial proportion of the population. And again, that's part then of the difference between the Rim South and the Deep South. The Deep South had much higher Black populations and concentrations, and was therefore slower to begin to realign to the Republican Party. So I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to argue for a new means or dichotomy in the South, the growth South versus the stagnant South. First, I want to go through and show how the growth South differs from the stagnant South, just in terms of demographics. And then we're going to look at the political consequences of that. Kind of get into that. In 2020, there were 4 new senators sent to the Senate from the South. And let me contrast those. In Georgia, we elected 2 senators. One of those was Jewish. He's also the youngest member of the Senate at 33. The other one, an African-American preacher, the first popularly elected Democratic Black senator ever sent from the South. Yeah, Tim Scott, he's a Republican. Okay. In contrast, in Alabama, the new senator there is Tommy Tuberville, a former football coach, white guy, and Protestant. And then the other one comes from Tennessee, Bill Haggerty, another white individual, defines himself as being a conservative Christian, and was from a equity fund. So very different kinds of senators coming from these 3 states, one of which, Georgia, I classify as being a growth state, and the other 2 being stagnant states. And they send to the Senate kind of more traditional kinds of senators. So the first realignment, I'm going to do this very quickly, that begins in the Rim South, and it takes place beginning in the 1950s with Eisenhower. He carries most of those states. He has coattails, so he elects some Republicans to the Senate, to the House from those states. And then the first Republican senator in modern times in the South comes from Texas, John Tower, back in 1961. First Republican governors from the South come from Arkansas and from Florida, again, kind of Rim South states. And the Deep South states don't begin to follow that same pattern until you get to the 1960s. In the 1960s, Barry Goldwater sweeps the Deep South states, and in every one of those states, except for Louisiana, he has coattails, so he brings in new Republicans to serve in the U.S. House. And Alabama stands out here in that 5 of the 8 representatives sent to Congress from Alabama in 1964 were Republicans. Again, Alabama had sent a Republican to the House, and any time in the 20th century up until that point. So the Rim South, Deep South, yeah, they moved at very different stages and paces. But as I'm going to talk about what I'm going to call the growth South versus the stagnant South. Now, the growth South is made up of the Eastern Seaboard. So we got Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and then Texas. And so that leaves then in the stagnant South, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Tennessee. And yeah, I'll grant you that South Carolina is kind of a difficult placement, and there are going to be some things we're going to see about South Carolina, which makes it look actually more like the stagnant South than the growth South, at least in terms of its partisanship. But growth, what brings about growth? Why do people change and move? And again, this is going to be, oh man, let me get it. I think people move because of things like they want to improve their lifestyle. They want new opportunities. So part of this is jobs, and you go where you can get either a job or a better paying job, or retirement. Again, you want to change your life. You're tired of scraping your windows in the winter and shoveling snow. And so you may move all the way to Florida, but then also Georgia and North Carolina get a lot of halfbacks, people who maybe went to Florida and then said, man, I want to see a change of season. So they moved to North Georgia and North Carolina. And then you got the millennials, the Gen Zers who are looking for an exciting place to live, and places that show up on their list of where they might want to settle once they get their education behind them. Atlanta, Austin, the Research Triangle, the DC suburbs, Charlotte brings people in. Atlanta, known as the Black Mecca, so huge swath of parts of Atlanta, very wealthy, very affluent, lots of job opportunities, professional opportunities for African Americans come to Atlanta. And then Miami was often sometimes referred to as the capital of Latin America, that so many people from Central America, South America have come to Miami. Texas, huge draw, and we just saw that it, speaking of 2 new members of Congress, discovered that yesterday, got 3 of the nation's 10 largest cities and 4 of the nation's 30 largest metropolitan areas. So yeah, parts of the South are growing and growing very dramatically. Now, how do we measure growth? All right, as a political scientist, I perhaps measured a bit differently than most normal people would. So as a political scientist, one of the things I always look at is a state growing faster than the nation, slower than the nation, about keeping pace with the nation? And again, the announcement yesterday on reapportionment tells us exactly what has happened over the last decade, which states were moving a lot faster than the nation, which ones were falling behind. If we go back and we look at the experience over the last now 70 years, here we see, the growth states, Florida added 20 members of Congress during that period. Texas has picked up 16. The only state that has added more members of Congress during that 70-year period was California. Georgia with 4 members, the only states that have outpaced it in terms of adding representatives would be the 2 right above it, plus California and Arizona. So Georgia, a major growth state. North Carolina added a second new member just yesterday. So each of the growth states has added at least 1 member of Congress during this period. So at some point, they were growing faster than the nation as a whole. Stagnant states, the best done there is Tennessee, which has held its own. Alabama lost 2, and matter of fact, it dodged a bullet. Most everyone thought it was going to lose another seat. Didn't happen yesterday. So Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi have each lost 2 seats during this same kind of period. To look at what most normal people, i.e. not political scientists, would consider, which would just be growth in the population, again, we see dramatic differences. For the growth states have more than doubled their population. Here we're talking about less than 50 years, and my hunch is once we get the 2020 census for South Carolina, it will have also doubled its population this period. Where the stagnant states, the best shown is Tennessee, which has grown by about 3/4, but Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana have not even increased their populations by half during this 50-year period. It's kind of one point in reference. If one goes back to 1960, Georgia was only about 1/10 larger than Alabama in population. Now, it is more than twice the population of Alabama. So, I think this makes the point that by using 2 different measures, the growth states are indeed growing. The stagnant states, at best, are holding their own, that they are not growing. They're not adding on the populations. So what makes a state attractive? Why do you move there? As I say, it may be for jobs. It may be your employer transfers you there. What are employers looking for? Where do they go and set up new regional headquarters? They're looking for a well-educated population. So if we look here at college-educated potential workers, Virginia leads the pack here with 37, about 3 in 8 of its adults have a college education. Georgia, North Carolina, reasonably close behind at about 30%. And we do have a little bit of overlap here in that essentially Tennessee and South Carolina have, again, just each of them about 1/4 of its adult population have college educations, but we see trailing well behind Arkansas and Mississippi. Only a little over 1/5 of their adult populations have college educations. And so that may be part of the problem that they would have in attracting new industry is, their workforce is not as well trained as, say, over in the growth states. Something that comes along with well-educated population. I'm not going to show a slide on this, but would be incomes. And again, the growth states are much more affluent in terms of the median family income. Indeed, Virginia is 8th in the nation. That's, again, doing the best in the South, where Arkansas and Mississippi are ranked 49th and 50th. And indeed, the stagnant states are all clustered somewhere between 43 and 50. So, not doing that well economically. As a state attracts people to come and live, to work in the state, then a smaller and smaller share of that state's population is homegrown, or folks who grew up there. Again, we see that 2 of the growth states, most of the people who live in there weren't born there. Indeed, in Florida, it's barely a third of the folks in Florida were actually natives, and in Virginia, it's just under half. Georgia, a little bit above half. And again, we see, and we can distinguish between the growth states, all of which have smaller shares of their populations who are native than in the stagnant states. And then Louisiana, more than 3/4 of the folks there were born there, lived there probably their whole lives. And Alabama and Mississippi, it's right at 70%. Now, some implications from this is that people who move into a state may bring in new ideas, different ideas, or what is particularly interesting for a political scientist, they may bring in different partisanship. And sure enough, what we see often in states is that the people who have moved there, who've been there a relatively short period of time, differ politically from those who've been there all their lives. And what we're seeing now is that these new folks moving into these southern states are coming from the upper Midwest, or from up in New England even, or even moving east from California because they're tired of worrying about whether their house is going to burn up in a forest fire or going to slide off the side of a hill in a mudslide. These people who are coming to the South, they're much more likely to be Democrats than the people who are living here, who are much more likely to be Republicans. So this change is, people who are moving into the state, reducing the share of the native-born population, has political implications. Another feature of that would be to look at the racial and ethnic makeup. And it's kind of hard to know exactly how to approach this. And this looks at the non-white population percentages, led by Texas, which is one of the handful of states which is no longer majority white. Georgia and Florida will join Texas in the not too distant future, where we've got a place like Tennessee, 3/4 of its population is still white, and about the same kind of thing in Arkansas. In terms of ethnicities, who votes Republican? Well, whites are the only group that votes overwhelmingly Republican. African Americans vote overwhelmingly Democratic, usually hitting somewhere in the upper 80%, even 90% sometimes. And again, these growth states, you also have increasing numbers of Hispanics, you have increasing numbers of Asians, and they tend to be more Democratic and Republican, certainly not at 85, 90% like African Americans. It's usually more in the 60% range. And so, yeah, that's why I came up and use these figures. You do see some overlap in that Mississippi and Louisiana, more than 40% non-white. That's largely because those have very high concentrations of African Americans. It's not because they have a whole lot of Asians or Hispanics in those states. But this diversity in terms of ethnicity also then becomes an important factor in terms of whether or not a state is likely to begin to vote Democratic or to begin to elect some Democrats. We'll look now at what has happened in terms of presidential elections. So now we're moving out of talking about the demography of the states and how that demography may be changing, and looking at the political consequences. So looking first at what happened in the presidential elections last year. Okay, Virginia now, it's become a blue state. With 10 percentage points difference between Biden and Trump, that's right at the range which you begin to talk about it being a landslide. Anything more than kind of 55-45 is often thought of as a landslide. Now, the next 4 states on the growth side, Georgia, which very narrowly went for Joe Biden. Indeed, if you were paying a lot of attention, you may remember that there was a phone call made by Donald Trump on the Saturday before the Congress confirmed the outcomes of the Electoral College, in which Trump begged Georgia's Secretary of State to find, was his terms, 11,780 votes for Trump. And that, as Trump pointed out, would flip the state. So that's how close Georgia was, 0.2%, but it did go Democratic for the first time in a presidential election since 1996. Now, the next three states, they stayed on the Republican side. Both of North Carolina and Florida did vote Democratic in 2008, and Florida also did so in 2012. Texas has not done so recently. But Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Texas, these are toss-up states, and they're going to be very competitive probably throughout this next decade. Certainly in 2024, I expect they will be. Georgia, Florida, and Texas all have their statewide constitutional officers going to be on the ballot in 2022, and I expect there's going to be big battles there. If we look over at the stagnant states, we see that they are not that competitive. And while Trump wins South Carolina by a landslide, it nonetheless is more competitive than any of the stagnant states. And when you look at Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, it's hard to think of a scenario under which many of those states would vote for a Democrat unless the Republican Party put forth a child molester, which might then flip it. But otherwise, there's just not much likelihood those are going to be in the blue category, where North Carolina, Florida, Texas, it's quite conceivable that in 2024 they might, guarantee, but they might. Of course, Georgia might also slip back and be a red state in 2024, but at least those are fairly competitive. What makes them competitive? Well, in any of these states, the minority population, the minority electorate is going to be a Democratic electorate. So if a Democrat can win these, the Democrat has to do reasonably well with white voters. And there we see Virginia, where Biden gets almost half of the white vote. So with that, he doesn't have to do particularly well with the minority vote, and he's going to win. But interestingly, although Florida and Texas, kind of mid-30s in terms of its white share, Biden didn't get enough of the minority vote. He does get enough of the minority vote in Georgia at 29%, but that's the same share of the white vote that Tennessee cast for Biden. And yet Tennessee was a very, very red state, and Georgia became just a faint, maybe even one would say a Carolina blue state. And why is that? Well, let's back up here to this slide. It's because Georgia has a lot more of a non-white population, and by combining that 29% among whites plus a sizable share of that non-white population, Georgia would flip, where Tennessee, we notice, has very, very relatively small non-white population. So in that state, no, getting 29% of the white vote is not going to do it in Tennessee. Yeah, so again, we see there's a bit of an overlap here, but we have to bring in that other factor. What about the size of that non-white vote? Now I'm going to show you a slide which is going to look at three states. And this is going to be looking over time at how they voted in presidential elections. So we're going to have Virginia here, which is the most bluest Democratic state. We're going to have Alabama. And for Alabama, I could actually have substituted pretty much any one of the other stagnant states because you see pretty much the same pattern. And then Georgia. Okay, what do we see here? All right, we see that back in the 1950s, Virginia is far more Republican than Georgia or Alabama. And indeed, Virginia begins voting for Republicans for president in 1952 and does so for more than a half a century after that, except for 1964. We see that in 1964, both Georgia and Alabama vote for Barry Goldwater. And that's the one exception when Virginia kind of drops down and doesn't follow that pattern. In 68, Alabama's got a home state son, got George Wallace running for president, and so the Republican vote bottom falls out of it, and it drops down substantially also for Georgia, which also voted for Goldwater. In 76 and 80, the Georgia numbers are not tracking that closely with the others. Why is that? Well, again, Georgia had a home state boy, had Jimmy Carter on the ballot in both of those. But other than that, we're really beginning here in about 72 and continue all the way out here to the new part of the new century. The three states are very similar. So that notion that all the South is pretty much the same politically, that would have been pretty much the case then. But then as we move into this new century, and we now see some differentiation building in, so that Virginia drops down and ends this essentially 56 years of voting for Republican and votes for Barack Obama and continues to vote for Democrats for the next 3 elections after that. So from 2008 to 2020, Virginia's on the blue side. Georgia begins to move away from Alabama and move away from the other stagnant states in terms of its preference for president. And finally, in 2020, just barely crosses over to the Democratic side. Where in Alabama, no, it's not moving in the next direction of the Democratic Party. Need very little difference here from 2004 till we get to 2020. So again, as I say, we can substitute the other stagnant states, and we'd have things which would look much like this. So again, it shows that this differentiation is building in, but also it shows it's a fairly recent break in the kind of trend which pretty much characterized things for a number of years. I'm going to talk now just a little bit about what's happening in terms of the congressional delegations from the South, and look at 2018. 2018 was a good year for Democrats, not just in the South, but across the nation. And what we see here is that of the growth states, all except North Carolina added at least one Democrat to its congressional delegation. So, it replaced a Republican with a Democrat, with Texas, which of course has the largest delegation, leading the pack with 4 flips. If we look over at the stagnant states, none of them broke ranks with their commitment to Republicans. None of them elected a Democrat. And indeed, Arkansas hasn't sent a new Democrat to Congress in a generation, essentially, not since 2000. Tennessee and Louisiana, almost as long, not since 2022, as a Democrat replaced a Republican. And even in Alabama, Mississippi, it's been more than a decade since a Democrat replaced a Republican. Now, again, you might look at this growth states and you say, well, yeah, okay, so the 2018, it was a great year for Democrats, but you might point out that those 2 Democrats who got elected from Florida both got defeated, replaced by, excuse me, a Republican in 2020. And also the Democrat who won there in Charleston in South Carolina was also replaced by a Republican, granted. But again, that's part of the national trend where Democrats lost seats pretty much across the country. And the only gains made by Democrats anywhere in the nation in 2020, where they picked up another seat in Georgia, and they picked up 2 seats in North Carolina. Yeah, but for that, the Democratic numbers in the U.S. House will be down to 219 instead of 222. So, yeah, these growth states as a group continued to move overall kind of in the blue direction, despite these kind of setbacks that Democrats experienced in Florida and South Carolina. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about state legislatures. Okay, first slide here, what this shows us is that Republicans were moving ahead in the growth states earlier than in the stagnant states. So that by 2000, there were 6 of the 12 legislative chambers in the growth states which were Republican majority. So both chambers in Florida, the South Carolina House, for example. By 2005, both chambers in Georgia have joined that. Indeed, everything in the growth states has become Republican by 2005, except for the 2 chambers in North Carolina. And North Carolina House was kind of flipping back and forth. But you see, there hasn't been any change yet in control of any of the chambers in the stagnant states. It comes much later in the stagnant states. And part of the reason I'm showing this is the argument I make that the states which moved from Democrat to Republican earlier are now the ones which are moving or beginning some signs of a Democratic rebirth, while the stagnant states go Republican much later, and in those states you're not seeing any hints that there's going to be any kind of swing back. Now, between 2009 and 2013, in every legislative chamber in the South, so all of 21 of the 22 Republicans made headway. So again, this swing back is fairly recent. It's quite recent. But if we look just then at 2014 to 2021, again, we see quite a difference. So again, if I'd shown you something like this for 2009 to 2013, essentially been all red, one blue dot. Well, here we see that for the growth states, for 9 of those 12 chambers, Democrats have made headway and made tremendous headway in Virginia. Indeed, in Virginia, going into the 2015 elections there, Republicans held 2/3 of the seats. After that election, they were down at a 1-seat majority at that point in their state house. So while Republicans made gains in the stagnant states in the 2009 2013 period, they continue to make gains. They make dramatic gains. So in 4 of those 10 chambers, they picked up an additional 10% of the seats or more. And in Arkansas, it's even more than that. And then another 3 chambers, the Mississippi Senate, the Alabama Senate, the Louisiana House, didn't quite be a 10% gain, but pretty close to it. So at the state legislative level, we again see this growing divergence with Democrats doing better in the growth states, Republicans doing better in picking up additional seats in the stagnant states. And of course, here on the growth states, the only 2 chambers that have flipped, i.e. flipped meaning going from being Republican majority to Democratic majority, were the two chambers in Virginia. So these other blues here for these other states, yeah, Democrats are making gains, but they aren't the majority yet. Looking at the same 3 states we looked at for the presidency, and here looking at changes in the state legislature over time. Again, for most of the period, really until into the 21st century, a lot more Republicans in Virginia than in Georgia or Alabama, the state legislature. And so the legislature in Virginia flips, back here about the turn of the century, late 1990s, and in Georgia and particularly Alabama, Republican Democrats still rule the roost. Have a shorter period here where the 3 states look very similar in terms of their partisan makeup of the state legislature. But then over the last, really not much more than the last half decade, we begin to see the separation. And so Virginia, the bottom kind of drops out. And by 2019, they have a majority within the Virginia House. In Georgia, yeah, it's still a ways to go, but it's gone from being close to 2/3 of the seats in the House, state House, being held by Republicans, and now it's down about 57, 58%. Alabama knows it's still increasing. And so that the Republican share of the legislative seats in Alabama is higher than it was ever in the other 2 states. And again, I could have substituted any of the other stagnant states, would have seen, particularly for Tennessee, would have seen much the same, and it would have been a bit lower in Louisiana, Mississippi, in part because they have such large Black populations. But again, we'd have seen the same kind of separation, with the stagnant states being much more Republican in their state house than Georgia, kind of what was an old rim South, a deep South state, but one which is changing fairly rapidly. Talked mainly so far primarily about Democrats, democratic growth, what has fueled that, what's happening. Need to keep in mind that Republicans certainly have a strong base. The core constituency of the Republican Party are white evangelicals. What's interesting here, if we look at the vote share of evangelicals for Trump last year, there's not a whole lot of variation. At the low end is Virginia at 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. At the high end, Louisiana, it's 91%. Not much variation. Indeed, for 7 of the chambers, 7 of the states, 4 on the stagnant side and 3 here on the growth side, it's really very narrow. It's 86 to 89. So it's really, that's just kind of statistical noise. That's difference, nothing meaningful there. So what's meaningful is what share of a state's electorate are white evangelicals. Florida, 20%, Virginia, a quarter, Texas, less than 30%, where Mississippi and Alabama, it's most of the electorate. So indeed, by the time the white evangelicals have voted, a Republican doesn't need to pick up much of the white non-evangelicals and just one. The same kind of thing is true for Arkansas and to a lesser extent for Tennessee. Again, one might look at it and say, well, gee, in Alabama, Georgia, they make up 39% of the electorate, and 90% of them almost voted for Trump. How did a Democrat manage to win? Again, it goes back to this much larger share of the population or the electorate in Georgia, which is not white. And then also remember that the white figure, was a little bit higher with the overall white share of the vote, which went for for Biden was about 29%, which was again much higher than in Mississippi, which was about 15%, as I recall. We can look back up at that slide and see exactly what's happening. So now realignment, yeah, it's looming, I would argue, at least in the growth state. Certainly wouldn't say it's there. I mean, I would say Virginia, yeah, it's taking place. And what's interesting is that the same forces which drove the realignment from Democrat to Republican back, a couple of generations ago, seem to be working now to drive these states from Republican to Democratic. So in part, it's fueled by new people who are moving into the states. That was what was happening again for that realignment of the Eisenhower and Goldwater years. It's more common, i.e. the change in voting patterns is more common among the more educated. It's more likely among younger voters, and younger voters, they tend to break away from what their parents have done and what parents have taught them. So we see that here. We see blacks at the leading edge. And yeah, it's true that back in the 50s, a lot of black voters were voting for Republicans. Because think about it. Who are the Democrats? Well, the Democrats were the old, racist folks who had imposed segregation. They were the Talmadges of Georgia, people like that. There was, George Wallace in Alabama. So yeah, if you were a black voter, you didn't see a whole lot of reason to want to vote for the local Democrats. You might vote for the Republican. And so, the election of Winthrop Rockefeller in Arkansas back in 1966, yeah, he gets the black vote because the Democratic Party was a party of oral phobos, the school of segregation there in Little Rock. First Republicans to be elected governors in North Carolina and Virginia. Again, got a lot of the black vote. Now in time, of course, with the Goldwater candidacy, that then begins to turn off a lot of that black vote. Again, a pattern similar in both of the times is that it begins in the urban areas. A difference, which may prove quite important here for this newest realignment, is the non-black minorities. And again, 67, 70 years ago, you just didn't have non-black minorities except down in the, South Texas. And that was about the only place you had that. So I would argue if we rank the growth states in terms of where they are in terms of Democratic prospects, yeah, I'd put Virginia, I'd color it blue. Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, color them purple. Texas, orange, actually probably burnt orange would be the way to think about Texas. And then South Carolina, yeah, that's still, I think, a red state. There's not much evidence of that. But in Virginia, I say it's a blue state. Yeah, I mean, all of its statewide elected officials are Democrats. I mean, of course, there are only 5. There are 2 senators and 3, governor, lieutenant governor, and AG. They're all Democrats. Virginia hadn't elected a Republican to the Senate now in almost 20 years, not since 2002. Georgia, yeah, purple, voted for Biden, elected 2 Democratic senators, Warnock and Ossoff. North Carolina, yeah, it didn't vote for Biden, but it did the same day re-elect Roy Cooper as governor. It also elected Democrats to serve as Attorney General, Secretary of State, and Auditor. So yeah, I mean, it's possible. Florida, again, didn't vote for Biden, but it did elect a Democrat as the Agriculture Commissioner and has voted twice for Obama. Texas, about the closest thing you can say there is Beto O'Rourke came within 2.6 points of defeating Ted Cruz back in 2018. South Carolina, yeah, there was all the excitement about Jamie Harrison, who attracted a lot of attention, attracted tons of money, tens of millions of dollars in his bid to unseat Lindsey Graham. But in the end, Harrison loses by more than 10 percentage points. So it isn't that close. It's kind of those things where a lot of people were voting with, or a lot of, Democrats were writing checkbooks based upon their heart and not their heads. They wanted to defeat Lindsey Graham, therefore they were willing to write checks. But Jamie Harrison really didn't have, very good prospects there. One last thing, what the condition in which Democrats win? Yeah, in Virginia, you get 45% of the white vote, you had the black vote, you're in, you're good, no problem there. In Georgia, it's a 30-30 situation. And this goes back to the Michelle Nunn candidacy for Senate back in 2014, where it was calculated that she could get 30% of the white vote. And if African Americans cast 30% of all votes, that would work for her. Well, that's pretty much what happened for Biden, for Ossoff, for Warnock, that whites cast right at 30% of the vote for the Democrats, and blacks cast right at 30% of all votes. Interesting, that's also exactly the combination which elected Doug Jones when he won the Senate contest in that special election 2017. North Carolina, Roy Cooper wins. He gets 35% of the white vote, 92% of the black vote. Biden loses by doing slightly worse. So pretty clearly, this is what a Democrat needs to aim for, is a third of the white vote, maybe just a hair over that, and a Democrat can win in North Carolina. In Florida, yeah, the Trump organization, Trump team began early on courting the Hispanic vote in South Florida and putting out the word that if Democrats won, it would be socialism. And you've got not just Cubans, but you also have Venezuelans, Bolivians, others, naturalized citizens in South Florida who've had the experience of living under a socialist dictator. And so that message from the Trump team worked well. And so it depressed the Hispanic vote. Yeah, Biden got the bulk of it, but he didn't do as well as Hillary Clinton had. If he had, then that plus the share of the white, the share of the black vote he got, he would have carried Florida. And in Texas, it's pretty much the same kind of thing. That we saw, 38% of the vote, white vote, went for Biden in Florida, 34% in Texas. So yeah, they were going to do is pump up more of the Hispanic vote to be able to win in those states. And in the stagnant states, as I say, the way that at least in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, those states could flip, again, if they could follow the pattern in Georgia. You have a 30-30 electorate, which would mean that they're going to need to have someone perhaps like, a homegrown Stacey Abrams come in, mobilize African Americans, get them registered, turn them out in large numbers, appeal to younger voters. And yeah, given the makeups of those states, if you could do that, if you could get from somewhere in the teens or 20% of the white vote, and then also have African Americans cast 30% of the vote, that would flip those states. But I think that's really quite a ways off. And so let me stop here and see if we've got anybody who generated questions, or if everybody has turned us off and gone and eaten supper.
Thanks so much, Chuck. Really interesting stuff here. Plenty for us to talk about. I will open it up for Q&A from the audience. So I'll take a first question for Chuck. I see a question has generated in the chat, so I'll just read it off from Zachary Peterson. Asked, with the trends you mentioned, do you see this as a long-lasting generational political realignment or a temporary change related to Trump's tenure in the White House?
Yeah, and that we aren't going to know until we see the next election. I think it has the potential that some of these purple states could move in the direction that Virginia has, and become increasingly Democratic. Although there's also then it may just be that the reason Georgia voted for these Democrats is that they were voting against Trump, and he's certainly not going to be on the ticket in 2022. He may be on 2024. Indeed, what I've been told by high up official in the Warnock candidacy, and she was quite candid. She said, we could not have won but for Donald Trump. Yes, Trump, he mobilizes the core Republicans, but also he turns out a lot of Democrats. What a Republican consultant told me was that the numbers, and this was worked up by a person who was a number cruncher on the Purdue campaign, was that for each additional vote that Trump could harvest for Republicans in rural Georgia, he cost them something between 1.1 and 1.2 votes in urban and suburban Georgia. So yeah, I mean, it's almost, you look at this and you say, Georgia Democrats ought to, bring Trump in for rallies in the state, and that would help their numbers. So yeah, we aren't going to know whether this is just an anti-Trump pushback in Georgia and maybe some of these other states, or whether, yeah, this is part of what would become a continuing trend like Virginia.
Yeah, what's really interesting to me is that, in some parts of the South, you almost have two realignments going on at the same time. You've got places like rural North Carolina, which is still de-aligning from the Democratic Party, but then you've got places like urban North Carolina, which are realigning with the Democratic Party. So you almost got these two different realignments going on at the exact same time, such that in North Carolina, you get an Obama victory in 2008, but then enough rural whites leave the Democratic Party, and it kind of brings the Republican, shores up those losses a little bit.
Yeah, what you see, you go into the kind of the mountain areas of North Carolina, Georgia, whatever, areas where there is essentially no minority vote, and you see some of those counties are going 90% Republican. So it's, yeah, yeah. Uh, as I told one of my political science colleagues who was in Atlanta, and telling him that if you were to go up to say the Walmart up in Clayton, Georgia, or Habersham County, Georgia, you might stand there all day and not find a white male who's going to vote for Biden.
We've got another question from one of our audience members. This is from one of our political science professors here at AUM, Pia Carnegie. She asks, you distinguish between Rim and Deep South. You also find a distinction between New and Old South in the literature. Are these two dichotomies referring to the same difference / contrast?
Not exactly, no. What I'm arguing is that Rim and peripheral or Deep South no longer work. And again, Georgia was a Deep South state. Now I moved into the growth category. And same with regard to South Carolina, where Arkansas and Tennessee were part of the Rim South. And it looks like to me they now fit better with the three states that were part of the Deep South. New South, yeah, that probably could be applied, within any state to the urban areas. And urban areas, I think, probably pretty much across the South are the ones which are changing. And the problem is in the stagnant states, there's not enough urban population to make those competitive yet. Think about Mississippi. Jackson, Mississippi is not a whole lot of urbanization there. And other than that, you really don't have much of an urban area in Mississippi, for example. So yeah, while Jackson is very, very blue, that's not going to show up much in terms of statewide voting.
I see we have another question from our audience. This is from Patrick Sheridan. Looking at the differences between the Georgia elections in November and the runoffs in January, we saw a decrease in turnout in more conservative rural areas, but turnout remained largely the same in urban areas, which tends to vote more Democratic. Do you think that the lack of Trump on the ballot influenced this, or is this a more general trend that might affect the realignment going forward?
I think there's a couple elements here. Yeah, the fact that Trump wasn't on the ballot, and that there apparently are some voters who will show up to vote only if Trump is on the ballot. Indeed, Trump has people kind of like the deadheads who will go to rallies wherever he is, even if it's a state they can't vote in. There's a piece done by Charles Bethia in the New Yorker, where he went to a big Trump rally up in Northwest Georgia, and he reports that a lot of people who were there weren't Georgians, couldn't possibly vote for that Senate contest. And that ostensibly was the reason that Trump had come down, was to mobilize the vote there for the Republicans. So that is part of it. If Trump's not on the ballot, then it cuts into Republican participation. Other thing, and again, this is unique to Georgia, and not likely to impact future elections. So again, that does make the success of those two Democrats kind of a little question mark over that. And that was, you had Republican operatives in this state telling Republicans, don't vote, don't go out and vote, because the two Republican senators aren't doing enough to help Donald Trump get Georgia, to flip the vote in Georgia. And again, I don't think most Republicans believe that, but these were reasonably close elections. Ossoff wins by 55,000 votes, while Warnock wins by about 90,000 votes. But undoubtedly, that also cut into the share of the Republicans who'd go and vote. And then, of course, there was Trump, who was saying constantly, "Don't trust Georgia's electoral system. It's rigged. It's it's stacked against us." And again, a Republican voter could look at that and say, "Well, why would I go participate in the system if the game is already rigged against us?" So yeah, that's why I say the Democrats say that Trump did a lot to help them with his rhetoric and with coming into the state. And indeed, again, this may be a question, which, was first the chicken or the egg, but the areas where Trump came into Georgia. So we had one big rally just before the general election in Rome. We had one literally on the eve of the special election in January up in Dalton. He also had one leading up to the special election down in Valdosta. And if you look at the parts of the state where there was the biggest drop off in participation, it was exactly in those areas. So his coming into those areas did not do anything to mobilize Republicans.
We have a question from Professor Naomi Slip from AUM. And she's asking if part of the rise of these growth states is based on the mobilization of minority voters, what are your thoughts on the potential impact of current proposed legislative changes to voting practices in some of these states, such as what Georgia just enacted? Do you think such changes might have a noticeable effect on the shifts that you're emphasizing?
Okay, yeah. Changes which were done in Georgia probably help Democrats. All right, why do I say that? All right, because what Democrats are going to do is they're going to run emphasizing that. They're going to argue that you need to turn out Democrats and vote because Republicans are trying to keep you from voting. They're trying to arrange new barriers to. And Stacey Abrams, who is likely to be the Democratic nominee for governor in 2022, is very effective. It was a major part of her message when she ran for governor in 2018. She lost by 55,000 votes, but her campaign reduced the margin by which Republicans had been winning the state by about 3/4. So yeah, that is a very, very effective message for Democrats, is to run against what these Republicans are doing. Will it increase Republican participation? Maybe so. I mean, a survey that was done by one of my colleagues here shows that a lot of Republicans say that they now have greater confidence in Georgia's electoral system because of these changes have been put into place. But I don't think they create major barriers to be overcome. And I think Democrats will run against them. And that'll be true in Georgia. Texas is probably going to make some changes, and Democrats will run against those changes also in Texas. So they can have a mobilizing effect on the Democratic vote.
Well, speaking of Texas, you mentioned some of the effects that Trump had on Hispanic voting among voters who perhaps grew up in more socialistic countries. But what the heck is going on in the Rio Grande, where these are not ancestral residents of places that have experienced violent dictatorships like that?
That's right. Yeah, larger Mexico. Yeah, and I think in Texas, probably as in Florida, Democrats ignored the organization steps they needed to take or should have taken to try to mobilize the Hispanic vote. I think they maybe were taking the Hispanic vote for granted. And I was hearing a lot of that, particularly I heard some of that from Texas, but also from Florida, is that the Democrats aren't doing what they need to be doing to mobilize these voters. I think maybe in Texas they looked at the huge increase in the urban populations of Houston, up in the Metroplex, but also in San Antonio and Austin, and thought, oh yeah, all these folks moving to these urban areas. We know urban areas are Democratic, and yeah, we're going to win. And it turned out it didn't work out that way. But yeah, I mean, some Texas politicos I was talking to were talking about, they might flip the Texas State House if they pick up several more seats in the congressional delegation. They thought they could win the state for Biden. None of that came to fruition. Absolutely none of it. So yeah, it looked like maybe they hadn't done the kind of grassroots work they needed to be doing.
Other questions for Dr. Bullock? And feel free to shoot those into the Q&A or through the chat function. Yeah. Do we have questions from either Paul or Naomi?
Well, about the Hispanic vote, I lived in Texas for a number of years, back in the 90s and in the aughts before going to Auburn. And one of the things I will say, I noticed about the Texas Hispanic vote is it's not monolithic. I mean, it's largely Mexican American, but even within the subculture, you've got just a more deeply social conservative base there, which has provided votes for Republicans. George W. Bush, when he was governor, did very, very well in those communities. But even after he stopped being governor, I mean, Rick Perry did very well for a Republican with Latino voters. Greg Abbott, I believe, ran against a Latino nominee 2 years ago and garnered a substantial amount of the Latino vote. It just seems like Texas, and I think Florida probably falls into that you're just dealing with it's not a monolithic voting bloc like African Americans tend to be. So it kind of complicates the realignment narrative in some of these states.
Yeah, and if Republicans would back off from some of their anti-immigrant positions and legislation they pass, they could probably do quite well among Hispanics who often are socially conservative. So it seems to me in states where they're running out of white voters, essentially, that the electorate is becoming increasingly diverse, that the place where Republicans ought to be looking would be towards Hispanics. And I think, again, they could make some headway if they were not so anti-immigrant. And again, the person who doesn't have documents, they can't vote, but they got family members, they got friends, they got other relatives who can. And, by alienating those, Republicans are denying themselves access to what could be a hospitable electorate. And as you point out, George Bush ran very, very well with them when he was both running for president, but also as governor. So that clearly is a group that Republicans could tap into.
Chuck, I'm curious, you talk to so many politicos in Georgia. I wonder what you hear from Republicans who, I'm sure they have these conversations of we're facing these really major, sort of demographic problems that the state is moving away from us. Do you notice a sort of counter mobilization effect of, all right, well, here's what we need to do to fix these problems and shore up our margins so that we don't become what the Democrats became a generation before?
It's interesting, David. It depends on who you talk to now. If you talk to political consultants, they're well aware of this and have been for a number of years. And indeed, I remember people, in the Kemp campaign, Governor Kemp campaign, telling me right after he won his election, and he wanted, concentrating on rural Georgia. I mean, that's where he was doing his tours and things like that. And they were saying, it worked for him in 2018. It won't work for him in 2022. So they kind of anticipated this is happening. But if you go and you talk to Republican legislators, Republican office holders, not so much so. And indeed, their view is not often statewide. It's kind of, I'm doing great. My district's fine, whatever. I'm not that worried about it. But the consultants, the people who are thinking statewide, they see this change coming and are scared to death of it, and would like to see those who are in office back off on some of the kinds of stands which they take, which they know are alienating voters that they might be able to otherwise attract.
I see that we're at 6 o'clock, so if we have maybe one more question for Chuck, feel free to put it in the chat or the Q&A. I'll take just a second to wait for any last questions. We'll see none. I will say thank you so much for being with us, Chuck. We really enjoyed having you here and learning a little bit more about these changing trends in the South. I hear so much about this from my students and from members of the media who want to know about how places like Alabama might be changing, and they're looking to our east at Georgia and wondering what might be in store for the future. And so we're all much better off having learned from some of your expertise. So thank you so much for having been with us.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you all. Thank you.